Hello and welcome back to the Cave Escape Podcast. I'm Caleb Groves.
And I'm Ashton Goolsby.
And today we're here to talk about fairy stories.
We have with us, though, guests to help us with that. None other than my brother Avery Goolsby.
Hello.
Who has recently written his senior thesis on the art of, or just the tradition of fairy stories or fairy tales, or we'll get into the terminology of that later.
Right.
But he has agreed to come with us today, or technically we've actually come to him today to talk about senior thesis, to break our long silence for the ending of school for these many weeks.
Yes.
So Caleb now has a degree.
Woohoo.
And he's free from homework.
Yes.
Now he gets to give it to third graders.
Yeah. I guess also, I don't know if we mentioned that I was going to be a teacher. I'll be a teacher at the school that Ashton is a teacher in the fall.
Yes, he will be third and I will be fourth.
It's going to be awesome.
We'll work together on that one.
Yeah.
So, guess just let's go on and dive in, I guess.
Yeah.
So, the first question I guess we should kind of get off started with is, what is a fairy story? So, can you help us out with that one?
Yes. So the thing about defining a fairy story is that it's very hard to define a fairy story. In fact, Tolkien wrote an entire essay titled, on fairy stories, and essentially he made the statement that it's not very easy to do, and honestly, it may not be you may not be able to do it at all. So part of the problem is there have been fairy stories written for basically as long back as we know. You can easily trace the story of Cinderella back, even before like the time of Christ. So part of the problem is because there are so many fairy stories, because they've been told in so many different ways and by so many different people, is you find one definition and it sounds more appealing than the other, but the problem is the problem that you're going to see is you have to try to fit every fairy tale into that bracket. So when Tolkien attempted to define it as well as he could, he split the stories by Beatrix Potter and Joel Chandler Harris, the stories of Brer Rabbit and Peter Rabbit. He's put those into a different category titled Beast Fables, kind of separated them from fairy stories. As they're kind of related, but they're not entirely related. And I agree with him that Peter Rabbit and Brer Rabbit are not fairy stories, but I do not necessarily entirely agree with his the way he defines the Beast Fables, because especially in the case of the Brothers Grimm, a lot of their fairy tales are kind of qualify as Beast Fables, and then that makes it sound like he's saying that those aren't fairy tales, but they're in a book titled Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales. And so it's very hard to define. So what Tolkien did, and what he was mainly concerned with, was kind of the structure of fairy tales. And so I think the main thing that you have to understand about fairy tales is that they teach morals, and I think that's just kind of widely agreed upon by anybody that's ever tried to define fairy tales, is that there is a moral somewhere in it. Little Red Riding Hood teaches about not talking to strangers, and Cinderella, Snow White, you learn to the importance of love or whatever. There's gonna be some sort of moral, at least one moral somewhere in that story that's never really been disputed. I think personally, and I've heard this argued before by various people, that part of the art of displaying those morals in fairy tales, which in contrast to other genres of literature, is that the moral is not stated word for word. It is implied between the lines of the story. So I think an example I used when writing my senior thesis was the Berenstain Bears. I said that for all the love that I have for the Berenstain Bears, for all that I read them throughout my childhood, Mama and Papa usually told sister and brother that what they were doing was wrong or that they needed to do it like this. And so you are learning when you read those stories, but the difference is that they are being, you as the reader are being told exactly what the moral is. Whereas in the fairy tales, it is a story, and through that story, you are shown why you should be brave, why you should be courageous, why you should not tell lies, why you should not talk to strangers. But it's never necessarily said in Little Red Riding Hood to not talk to strangers. You just learn through Little Red Riding Hood's mistakes that you should not talk to strangers.
So it's not like Aesop's fables, where like you have the tortoise and the hare, and at the end it ends and says, "Slow and steady wins the race." That would not be a fairy story.
Yes, no.
So fables and fairy stories are different.
Those would be different, yes. And then another concern that Tolkien had was the happily ever after. He coined this word. He called it eucatastrophe. It is the sudden turning of what seems an inescapable, doom in the story. The hero has no way out, or the protagonist has no way out, and then they are rescued, often by some form of Deus Ex Machina, and there's a happily ever after. And he thought that was very important. No fairy tale is complete without it. Now, what I will add to that is that you assume that means that the main character lives happily ever after. Now, the first thing you have to understand, and I'll probably have to talk more about this later, but it's too big of a tangent to get into right now, is that your protagonist of the fairy tale is not always the main character. So one example I will use is the death of the little hen. The little hen is the protagonist of that story, but she is not the hero. In fact, you would probably consider her the villain. And in fact, she dies midway through the story. And by the end of the story, everybody has died. But the joy that is the happily ever after is not for the death for the little hen. The happily ever after is for the other people in the story who get to be rescued from the gluttony of the little hen. This gluttony killed the little hen, and the other characters in the story no longer have to put up with the little hen. And then it is also for the reader, who also gets to see this gluttonous protagonist meet her just reward. Now, in the cases of Snow White and Cinderella, it is that happily ever after that we usually think of, where they get to run off with the prince and they get to live in a castle, have all the riches they could ever want, true love and all of that. But although that is what we usually think of when we talk about happily ever after, that is not always the case, especially in the cases of the Brothers Grimm, whose very names speak for how a lot of their stories play out. It is often very grimful.
So if the point of it's not the happy ending,
the point is there will be some sort of happiness at the ending. Someone somewhere will find happiness at the ending, but the point is not that the protagonist will find happiness. Now, the hero will always find happiness, but also, even in the case of the fairy tale The Death of the Little Hen, there is no hero. There's not really any hero in the story. In fact, pretty much every character in the story dies.
So why should we read these stories then? Because I guess just why should we read these? What is there in them? There's fairly simple for the most part, aren't they? They're not like long novels, and they're not true things that actually happened. So clearly, you said Cinderella's been around since before the time of Christ. They've stuck around. Mm-hmm. What is it about them that it just kind of endures, that makes them worth reading?
I think, and this is something that I did not get a lot of chance to talk about in my defense or in my paper for my senior thesis, but I really wanted to talk a lot more about in my defense of my senior thesis, and I was actually originally when I started, I wanted this was really going to be the main talking point. I just things changed along the way, but I think a very strong draw to those stories for us as humans comes in that a lot of these elements from fairy tales, dragons and giants and fairies, whatever else, it all it's very we can see those creatures in the Bible. I think that the serpent in the garden was some form of a dragon, namely in Revelations 20, I think it's verse 2, the dragon or the serpent and Satan are referred to as a dragon, and I know they're referred to as a dragon in other places in Revelations, and I'm sure in other books of the Bible as well. In First Samuel, we read about David and Goliath, and so we know there were giants in the Bible. And I think part of what we find appealing about fairy tales is that possibly these elements of fairy used to exist in the real world, and as we have come further and further into this fallen world that we are now living in, we lost the connection with those creatures. And so in stories where we read about morality and virtue, then we are also reading about creatures that used to be more connected with a more virtuous world, a more perfect world.
Yeah, I liked that was actually how you closed your thesis. I liked you said the elements of the fairy tale world used to exist in the real world from biblical times closer to the perfect world of the Garden of Eden. Now, instead of meeting giants and dragons in the real world, mankind reads about them in fairy tales that remind them what a perfect world could look like. I liked the way you closed that. The idea of like it calls back to mind the things closer to Eden. I like that. I also noticed you are referring to adults, it seems like. So typically we think of fairy tales and things as being for kids. Would you say that that's true?
So that is another difficult question to answer. Even writing my paper, I flip-flopped back and forth on this answer. And so the answer I came to was that they are meant for both children and adults. So, for example, one of the sources I used for my senior thesis defense was Hillsdale's College classical children's literature course. It's a free online course on Hillsdale's website. And so the name of that course, classical children's literature, you kind of look at that and you're like, okay, so if it's children's literature, why are we studying it at a college for adults or almost adults, not 5-year-olds or anything? And why are these adult men teaching this course? And so what we mean when we say children's literature, I think it is more meant as literature that can be enjoyed by children. I don't think anyone is going to dispute that a child is going to enjoy reading or watching Cinderella. But what people miss and what people do not understand is that the morals go way deeper than just the simple happily ever after. Cinderella meets the prince and she gets to live happily ever after. The moral of true love. It goes way deeper than that. You attended... I know, Ashton, you attended like Mr. Wilbur's lecture about fairy tales.
Yeah, were you there for that back in the fall?
I was not able to go to that. Yeah,
Was
I
that
remember.
a collegium with student weekend, or was that something different?
That was
No,
something
actually, it
different.
was something different, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
You've heard him talk about fairy stories before, though, right?
Yeah, like here and there.
Like pretty much every breathing second
Yeah.
of his life.
Right.
But just listening to Mr. Wilbur talk about that for I don't even remember how long we were there, but the fact that an adult man can take that and pick it apart, word by word, sentence by sentence, and we can spend multiple hours talking about these fairy tales means that there's a lot more depth to it than just the simple, cute little story that we might read our children when they go to bed at night. And there's almost definitely a lot more to them than what a child's brain is going to pick up on.
It's like what also the guy who wrote that book that we were talking about earlier, the
Tending the Heart of Virtue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Vegan Groin.
Yeah, I'm listening to a thing right now for teacher training for school. I should be done with it, but I'm a couple days behind. But that guy who wrote that book, he's talking about the same stuff, and it's one of those two where he said, I used to teach a collegiate level course on this, so I mean, there's got to be something. And he said he got it from listening to them with his kids and then reading to his grandkids. He's like, there's something that's got to be important in this. Mm-hmm. And I believe he's Orthodox, but he was talking about, and I think his vision of it, given the tradition that he has to go with his faith, he kept tying it back to that. And he even, multiple times he said, the Catholics read fairy stories well. The Catholics read fairy stories well. So there's something about, I think, even, which I guess goes back to what you were saying about the tradition with the garden of tying fairy tales into tradition somehow.
Yeah. I was just listening on the way up here. I was listening to a podcast where they're interviewing Joshua Gibbs about his book that just came out called Loving What Lasts, I think. And it's basically about, like, he kind of divides, like, cultural artifacts into 3 categories, being common, uncommon, and mediocre. And he was like, the common ones are the ones that kind of, like, last for, like, a whole generation, maybe, like, 75 years, and, like, everybody's like, this is a good thing. But after that, it kind of goes away. Mediocre is, like, super, like, fads. Pop culture, yeah. They're there for, like, a week, and then they're not. But then you have, like, the uncommon ones, which are things like Paradise Lost and the Divine Comedy that they last forever. Because there's something about them, or like the Goldberg variations is another thing that he listed, and they're these things that are in tune with beauty in such a way that we can't stop looking at them, and we'd never get tired of them as a people, and so they stay with us forever, and like everybody just says that these things are good things.
Yeah,
and so I think fairy stories. I mean, clearly fairy stories have lasted, again, like you're saying, from before the time of Christ, and so they're pretty old. And so there's something about them that makes them last like that, and so there's something about them that makes them worth studying.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even just given the fact that they've lasted that long.
Right.
It's history even at that point, but then they have to have lasted for some reason. Right. There's got to be something in them that's worth holding on to. So I wanted to go back to, we were talking about this being for adults, and like adults can enjoy it, but it being something that is more intended for the children, I think is kind of what we said. But then there was this idea, you quoted Chesterton from Orthodoxy, and I'm going to have to flip through because I hate technology. I printed it off on paper so I could write on it. I've got the footnote somewhere, but you quoted Chesterton from Orthodoxy talking about childlike wonder, I think it was. Do you remember what quote that was?
No.
As I try to find it.
Because that was actually recommended to me by a friend that I should incorporate that into my paper. So shout out to Evan Schultz for doing that for me.
Well, I can't find the page exactly. I put page 6, but that's not right. But do you know what he means by having childlike wonder? Have you heard that phrase before?
Yes. I think it may not be entirely the same thing, but Lewis Carroll was very concerned with childhood innocence. Would you say that's roughly along the same lines as what childhood wonder is?
I think it's a little bit different. The way you've heard that phrase before, right?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The phrase, the way I understood it, was this idea of, like, if you give a kid a story, they're going to want to just read it again because to them, it's just as good the second time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and this may be the Chesterton idea that this came from. A lot of people talk about this, but the idea of, he said, God having this sense of childlike wonder where the sun rises and then it sets, and he says, do it again. And so it does it again the next day. So learning to have this just excitement, I guess would be a word for it. Excitement like a child, where a child just sees something and is like, that's amazing, I want to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
That was fun. A second time, let's do it again. Let's do it again. So that's how I understood it.
Yeah.
Would you say that there's something of that in like fairy stories, that they encourage that kind of repetition?
In that they're told over and over again.
Yeah. Or like the themes even.
I mean, I also think of, when I think childlike wonder, I think of a kid going outside and then playing for hours with sticks and rocks.
Yeah. They
like,
find beauty
just like
in everything.
finding wondering in such like simple and mundane things, because there is wonder and beauty in those things.
Yeah.
But as adults, we tend to kind of forget that and not wonder in those things.
Yeah.
So that would be, because I talked a little bit about, in my senior thesis, I talked a little bit about the difference between childlike and childish. That would fall more in the lines of childlike.
Yeah, I think that was more of
Yeah.
what I was
Yes.
getting at. I couldn't remember exactly. Yeah, that's what the phrasing was in your paper.
Yeah. So, the childlikeness is more that, childlike wonder, the childhood innocence, the, put it simply, the admirable qualities of childhood. And then you have the childish qualities, like, throwing tantrums when you don't get your way or anything like that. That is not an admirable quality. But, being able to watch, as a child, I watched The Fox and the Hound. I watched Peter Pan. I watched it over and over again. I would read the same Berenstain Bears stories over and over again. And then just, being able to go outside and, play with sticks and rocks, and, you'll be able to find joy in that, find joy in the little things in life. That is an admirable quality. And have we talked about the virtues yet?
No, we didn't.
Do we want to talk about that now? Or?
Sure, go ahead.
So the 7 virtues, they're split up into 2 categories. The first 4 are the cardinal virtues. And I'm pulling this from Mere Christianity. There's not a specific chapter because he splits it up into several different chapters.
Mm-hmm.
But the first cardinal virtues are just recognized by all of society. Really anyone you pass on the streets will, kind of agree that these are virtues. And so the cardinal virtues are prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. And then the theological ones are namely recognized by Christians. They are love, also called charity, and then faith and hope. And obviously, I cannot go into as much detail as I want, or as much detail as C.S. Lewis went into, but this falls in line with what he talks about when he talks about prudence. I think he cites the verse, what is it? To be as harmless as doves, but as wise as serpents.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so he talks about, when you think of, prudence, you don't really think of, children, because, they're often, you get those terms of childlike and childish confused. But he says, no, children often show prudence what they do. They often, show a lot of care and put a lot of care into what they're doing. And so, it falls in line with the, in the realms of prudence. But the whole thing with prudence is, be as harmless as doves, and that's more of, falls in line with childlikeness. But then you also have to be, as wise as serpents, and that's where adulthood comes in. So you can't just be childlike all the time. You have to have I think this is a direct quote from Your Christianity. God wants a child's heart but an adult's brain. And that doesn't mean you have to have just like a certain IQ to get into heaven. It means that you need to, show as much wisdom as you are able to. It doesn't mean he's only going to let Harvard graduates into heaven. But
Well, it's like he says, suffer not, or prevent not the little children. I'm blanking on the
Let
words.
the little children come to me.
Yeah, let the little children come unto me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. But then he also, Paul says later, when I was a child, I thought as a child act like a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things.
Mhm.
But then the idea of also, I think it was Paul again talking about feeding, when you're young, feeding you with milk, but when you get older, you switch to solid food instead.
Right.
So this idea of there's this balance of the kingdom of heaven is of children, but then also we're called to be mature and wise.
Mm-hmm.
So it can't be like you were saying, like the difference of childlike and childish. I like that. There'll be childish,
Right.
but there's some quality of a child that you need to be like them.
Right.
So
so
do you think fairy tales help us to kind of get at that?
yeah, can I give a one or two specific
Yeah,
examples?
Go ahead.
So one example, and I don't think I talked about this in my paper, but I know I talked about it in my defense. The example of Peter Pan. Peter Pan contrasted with Wendy Darling. The difference between them was that both at the beginning wanted to stay children for forever, but as Wendy Darling accompanied Peter Pan through Neverland throughout the story, she realized that yes, he is childlike, and she did admire that quality in him. He was also childish, and so the reason they part ways at the end of the story is she comes to understand the difference between being childlike, the difference between the childlike wonder, the childlike innocence, and those childish qualities, the throwing a tantrum when you don't get your way, like when she first expresses the idea of wanting to go home to her mother. Peter Pan just kind of throws a tantrum. It's like, all right, get out of here. And so that was kind of a childish response, not a childlike response. That was not a very virtuous, admirable response to that. He didn't want to talk it out. He didn't want to reason with it. He was very angry. Get out of here. Like, even I mean, that was a childish response, not a childlike response. And then, not necessarily the exact same thing, but I guess to kind of prepare for what I'm about to say. Here's a quote from C.S. Lewis in his essay, Three Ways of Writing for Children. Critics who treat adult as a term of approval instead of as merely a descriptive term cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these are things and are marks of childhood and adolescence. And in childhood and adolescence, they are, in moderation, healthy symptoms. Young things ought to want to grow. But to carry on into middle life or even into early manhood, this concern about being adult is a mark of really arrested development. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret, and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up. So, were you gonna say something?
Well, is he saying being an adult is bad?
Yeah.
So, I think trying to put it in as simple terms as possible. When you are an adult, like we were talking about, being an adult, having the adult's brain and but also the child's heart, but not looking down on childhood now that you are an adult, because you have to distinguish the childlike virtues from the not disgusting, but the childish qualities in a child.
Sometimes kids are disgusting.
Yeah, sometimes they are disgusting. They get sticky. But
I feel like Atticus came in earlier. The bottom of his features is black with mud. He'd been running through the yard barefoot for I don't know how many hours.
But adults do that too.
yeah.
Yeah, that is true, I guess. But it's not as common as little
That's
kids.
true.
I feel
Hey,
like.
Sydney does that. So
That's true.
But playing off what he said there, you start to see why in the last battle, Susan Pavinci did not join Peter, Edmund, and Lucy, and Edmund and Polly and Diggory. and all the other main characters throughout the Chronicles of Narnia, why Susan Pevensey was not there to join in the afterlife at the end of the last battle, at the end of the Chronicles. And a lot of people see that as, Lewis being, sexist, because I think a reason given in the books is because she was a lot more concerned with makeup and, lipstick and all that stuff. And possibly that was, just some poor word choices on Lewis's part. He was not saying that Susan did not get into heaven because she was feminine. What he was saying was she was more concerned with, though, because makeup is not seen as like a child thing. Most parents don't just let their 6-year-old girls do makeup and lipstick and all that. Well, partially because they're not going to do it very well, but also just because that's not something that a 6-year-old needs to be getting into. So Susan was a lot more concerned with parties and doing her makeup and all that, and she did not want anybody thinking that she believed in this, what they would call a made-up world called Narnia, where she believed she once reigned as a queen, and they didn't want her. She did not want anybody to think that she believed that ever happened. She did not want to associate herself with her siblings who did believe this. And so it's because Susan is never in the last battle, we never really see if there's even any, if she actually remembers that, or if she's just kind of blotted it all out and convinced herself that it never happened. But I think through reading the story, you can kind of see, I think she's very aware that it was real, but she does not want anybody to think that she thinks that. Any of her adult friends, and you can even see that throughout The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Prince Caspian, where she was always the most grown up of the group. She was always trying to be the most rational and the most simple minded. Like, this is how it is. It's facts and logic.
Yeah.
And even when you hear Edmund and Lucy talking about her in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, you can kind of see she's already trying to disassociate herself from Narnia, and she's already getting into these parties and things. And then by the last battle, she's kind of just, she does not seem to be very connected with her siblings and her cousin and all their other friends anymore.
It kind of made me think of the passage where it says, "Be in the world, but not of it."
Yeah.
She's chosen to be in the world and of it at the same time. So wherever she is, she seems to want to kind of make sure that she fits into that group.
Yeah.
And is not concerned about, well, yeah, this is true. Well, I can't admit that that's true because then I'm socially vulnerable.
So
that's kind of how I had read that.
in the puzzle piece that is Prudence, she has the piece of the adult brain, but she is rejecting the piece of the childlike wonder.
So real quick, we're kind of running out of time, sort of. We did have one story we wanted to get to and kind of look at just a little bit before the end. But I did have one final thing that I wanted to ask. So I've had a couple people recently over the past year or two, and I've heard online as well other people make the argument that, I mean, some of these stories are too dark for kids. I mean, you've got stories with like Cinderella, people getting their eyes pecked out or feet chopped off, and like you even said, which I've heard a lot of people complain about, people who make movies now based off of fairy tales, like Disney, they're afraid to put villains in there that are truly evil. I mean, you pointed out with the Frozen movies, which I'll leave my personal opinions out of this for a second, but the Frozen movies, like, there's no real villain in the movie that's ever really defined. And now some people I've heard say that's a good thing because, I mean, you don't want to traumatize the kid, give them something too scary. It might give them nightmares, but I don't know, what do you think about the idea of having bad villains? Because, I mean, even C.S. Lewis acknowledged he had nightmares as a child, but he was an advocate of tell these kids these scary fairy stories. I mean, why is it important to have evil in these fairy stories?
Yeah, so the first thing you have to understand is that C.S. Lewis grew up, he had a lot of nightmares, but what he believes is that you cannot eradicate any fear at all by the means of fairy tales. And he also believed that fairy tales did not they were not the beginning of a fear. They merely brought that fear to mind. If there was a fairy tale about a dragon and then you have a nightmare about a dragon, it's not because you're just now discovering that you had a fear of a dragon. That fear of a dragon basically exists with you as a person. But reading that fairy tale has just now, it's the idea of a dragon is now floating around in your head, and so when you go to sleep, you have a dream about a dragon. But then also, and this is a weird source, but it's such a good quote. It's from an episode of Criminal Minds. It's titled "If the Shoe Fits." I do not remember what season it was. There's like 15 seasons, so I cannot possibly even guess.
Good luck finding the quote.
The character Spencer Reed said, most fairy tales in their original form were gruesome to the extreme. In Cinderella, these stepsisters had their feet mutilated to fit in the shoe, and their eyes were eventually pecked out by doves. Sleeping Beauty was raped while she was unconscious by the king. Hansel and Gretel were held captive by a half-blind cannibal. Soldiers were instructed to cut out Snow White's liver and lungs so that the queen could feast upon them. He says, my point is, one could argue that the sanitized versions we have today are actually counterproductive to the original purpose of fairy tales, so the children can safely confront their darkest fears. So when we think of fairy tales, especially in the modern sense, we think of all, peace and love. Disney really pushes these ideas that you're perfect just the way you are. You can be whatever you want to be. These very utopia type ideas, but when you read the original fairy tales, or not the original fairy tales, because as we already talked about, Cinderella's been traced back a long time ago, but the popular versions by like the Brothers Grimm and stuff, I mean, those are very dark, twisted stories. And so the point was never really to have a perfect, happy world. There was always supposed to be some element of darkness in them. Sorry.
So it's more of a chance for the kids already have these fears, but the fairy story gives them a chance to face that fear and to deal with it in a way that's disconnected from themselves.
Yes.
And kind of settle it.
And then when we also think of courage, what we have to understand is that courage does not mean you are not afraid. When St. George goes and battles the dragon, it is not because he is not afraid. He is letting his courage outshine his fear. Mm-hmm. So, it's, I think I used I think I said it wouldn't have been little more than smushing a fly on the wall if he wasn't afraid of the dragon. Really, the only impressive part was that the dragon, for some reason, did not eat him. What is impressive is that he put his fears aside and he went out and he slayed the dragon.
Yeah.
Well, so we're running out of time. We were going to talk about a story. So I guess if you had like 2.5 minutes to say something about the Golden Bird, what would you say?
Yes. So the Golden Bird is like my favorite fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm, and I like it so much because it illustrates these ideas that I've been talking about this whole time. And one of the ideas that I kind of had to skip over earlier was the idea that your protagonist is not always the hero. And even listening to some of y'all's earlier podcasts, talked about superheroes and stuff. Now, usually in the case of those movies, your protagonist is going to be the superhero and the hero. Mm-hmm. In the case of many fairy tales, namely The Golden Bird, the hero is not the protagonist. The protagonist is the youngest son of the king, and he messes up over and over again. The hero is the fox who very kindly gives the son of the king these instructions over and over again on how to fix his mistakes and what he needs to do in order to right his wrongs and to do everything in order to achieve his happily ever after. And so the fox in this case would be the Christ figure, who swoops in to save this protagonist that is a flawed human being. And so he comes in, he forgives over and over again, he gives the instructions, and it is up to the king's son whether he is going to take this advice or not take this advice. And many times he does not take the advice, and he thinks he can find his own way, and then inevitably he realizes, oh wait, no, the fox has been right this whole time. And so he does what the fox says, and then he gets his happily ever after. And then really quick, something I did not talk about was that the structure of a fairy tale echoes the course of life. So you've got your once upon a time, you're born, you come into the world with no real knowledge, and then the middle of the story is kind of where you've got your morals of, virtue in there, and that's kind of when Satan tempts you, right. You can take the right path or the wrong path, and then the ending, the happily ever after, would be heaven. So in the case of the golden bird, after he follows out the fox's instructions and he gets his happily ever after, that is him making his way into heaven because he has now followed the instructions that the Christ figure of the story has given him, and so now he gets to enjoy the rewards of heaven.
But then even the fox is transformed in the end.
Yes.
So once the fox completes his work, he's transformed and then he's ultimately recognized.
Yes.
So is that like Christ having been there, walked through with us, and once his work is complete of redemption, he's then further glorified?
Yes. And I think that there's definitely something to be said about the fact that the Brothers Grimm, George MacDonald, Hans Christian Andersen, and just these C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, these very well-known authors of fairy tales and appreciators of fairy tales, they were all Christians. And so you have to start thinking, all right, so why are these Christians so involved in this genre, and what are they seeing that we are not seeing?
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, that was a great story. I read it this afternoon. It was one he recommended to us. I had asked about Cinderella, and he said, well, you need to read The Golden Bird. So I went and read it, and I realized I'd actually read it before, and I'd just forgotten, but it's a very good one.
Yeah.
So if you can find The Golden Bird by the Brothers Grimm, read it. It's very good.
It's very long. It's not as short as you would expect. It's several pages.
Yeah.
I think that brings us about to the end of our time, though.
Yeah.
So we'll have a synopsis up again on the blog, kind of giving you, I guess this one will probably be more just notes, but also possibly pushing you other places to find other stories to read, kind of hopefully take this and synthesize it, go out and read other things as well. But if you want to read that or anything else we've put up, you can find us at thecaveescapeblog.blogspot.com. And there's also a feature on there that you can leave comments. Leave comments if you have any questions or anything, or on Instagram or Facebook. I believe Spotify enables you to also ask questions.
I think so.
I'm not
I don't
sure
know how that functions, though.
If you figure out how that works, we do get notified. I got notified once on that. So we can see that. But also, if you have any questions, like topics you think we should delve into, we would welcome that as well.
For sure.
Anything else you need to add?
Not that I can think of. Well, thank you for listening. We'll be back next week because we're back to our regularly scheduled podcast.
Oh, thank you again, Avery, for coming on with us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
That was very enjoyable. Alrighty, well, thank you for listening, and until next week, take care.